When a corporate executive hurled the word useless at a humble delivery driver, he had no idea that one of the most powerful men in Hollywood was listening. What happened next would leave an entire restaurant in stunned silence and teach everyone, present a lesson they'd never forget. But before we dive into this incredible story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our global audience. The Golden Palm restaurant in Beverly Hills stood as a monument to excess and exclusivity. Its towering glass windows reflected the California sun, while inside, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had hosted countless A-list celebrities, business moguls, and political figures. The scent of truffle oil and aged wine hung in the air like an expensive perfume, while the soft murmur of hushed conversations created an atmosphere of refined sophistication. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was a statement. A place where power lunches determined the fate of multi-million-dollar deals and where being seen at the right table could make or break careers. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the lunch rush was in full swing. Waiters in crisp white shirts glided between tables with practiced precision, carrying plates that cost more than most people's weekly salary. The clientele represented the cream of Los Angeles society. Entertainment, executives discussing their next blockbuster, real estate developers sketching plans on napkins, and tech entrepreneurs raising their glasses to celebrate another successful IPO. Every conversation seemed to revolve around money, influence, and status, creating an invisible hierarchy that everyone understood but nobody openly acknowledged. In the corner booth, partially hidden behind a decorative palm plant, sat a man whose presence commanded attention even when he tried to remain inconspicuous. Arnold Schwarzenegger had chosen this secluded spot deliberately, hoping to enjoy a quiet meal without the usual circus of autograph seekers and selfie requests. His broad shoulders filled the leather banquette, and despite being in his 70s, his imposing frame still carried the unmistakable aura of strength that had made him a global icon. He wore a simple navy blazer over a white shirt, nothing flashy or attention-grabbing, yet there was something about his stillness that drew the eye, like a dormant volcano that could erupt at any moment. Arnold had come to the Golden Palm for a business meeting that had ended an hour ago, but he decided to linger over his coffee, enjoying the rare moment of solitude. His phone lay face down on the table, temporarily silenced from the constant stream of calls from agents, producers, and politicians seeking his attention. For now, he was content to observe the theater of human interaction playing out around him, occasionally nodding to familiar faces while remaining largely unnoticed in his corner sanctuary. The restaurant's atmosphere of controlled elegance was suddenly disrupted by the arrival of Gregory Hines, the regional manager for Lux Logistics, one of the city's most prestigious delivery services. Gregory burst through the restaurant's entrance like a man possessed, his expensive suit wrinkled from a morning of heated phone calls and emergency meetings. His face was flushed red with a combination of anger and stress, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. Everything about his body language screamed aggression and barely contained rage. Gregory Hines had built his reputation on being ruthless, demanding, and utterly intolerant of what he perceived as incompetence. At 45, he had clawed his way up the corporate ladder by stepping on anyone who got in his way, earning a reputation as the kind of manager who could squeeze productivity out of stone. His employees feared him, his peers avoided him, and his superiors tolerated him only because he delivered results. Today, however, those results were being threatened by what he considered the ultimate act of incompetence, and someone was going to pay for it. Behind Gregory, moving with considerably less urgency, was Jake Cowan, a 28-year-old delivery driver whose day had gone from bad to catastrophic in the span of 30 minutes. Jake's uniform, a navy polo shirt with the Lux Logistics logo, was slightly wrinkled from his morning rounds, and there was a small stain on his sleeve from when he'd helped an elderly customer with her groceries. His face bore the expression of someone who had long ago accepted that life rarely went according to plan, but his eyes held a quiet dignity that no amount of workplace abuse had been able to extinguish. He walked with the measured pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the battles that really mattered. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Gregory moved like a predator, circling wounded prey, his every gesture calculated to intimidate and dominate. Jake, meanwhile, carried himself with the quiet resignation of someone who had endured far worse than an angry boss and had somehow managed to maintain his humanity in the process. Where Gregory's anger radiated outward like heat from a furnace, Jake's calm seemed to absorb the negative energy around him, creating a strange sort of gravitational pull that made everyone in the restaurant unconsciously aware of the unfolding drama. The maitre d', Christopher Fletcher, approached the unlikely pair with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. His training had taught him to recognize the signs of potential disruption, and everything about Gregory Hines screamed trouble. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Christopher said with professional courtesy, though his eyes were already calculating. The best way to minimize whatever scene was about to unfold. "Do you have a reservation?" Gregory barely glanced at Christopher, his attention focused entirely on securing a table where he could properly humiliate his employee without interference. "We need a table. Now," he snapped, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to having his demands met without question. "This won't take long." Christopher's smile never wavered, though those who knew him well would have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Of course, sir. Right this way." He led them to a table in the center of the dining room, directly under one of the main chandeliers where the conversation would be impossible to ignore. Whether this placement was intentional or coincidental, it had the effect of turning their table into a stage, with every other diner becoming an unwilling audience member. As they settled into their seats, the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to shift. Conversations continued, but at a lower volume, with diners stealing glances at the oddly matched pair. The experienced restaurant-goers among them recognized the signs of an impending confrontation and prepared themselves for whatever entertainment was about to unfold. Some discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing that they might be about to witness something worth recording. Gregory wasted no time in launching into his attack. His voice, deliberately pitched to carry across the dining room, cut through the gentle hum of conversation like a blade through silk. "Do you have any idea what you've cost this company today, Jake?" The question was rhetorical, designed not to elicit information, but to establish dominance. "Do you have even the slightest comprehension of the damage you've done?" Jake sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for the storm to pass. He had been through this routine countless times with various supervisors over the years, and he had learned that engaging with the anger only made things worse. His strategy was simple: let them vent their frustration, apologize when necessary, and get back to work. It wasn't dignified, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for his aging mother and younger sister. "The Henderson account," Gregory continued, his voice rising with each word, "represents 3 years of relationship building, 3 years of carefully cultivated trust and reliability. And you, in your infinite wisdom, managed to destroy it all in a single morning." He leaned forward across the table, invading Jake's personal space in a classic intimidation tactic. Mrs. Henderson specifically requested morning delivery for her charity gala preparations. The flowers, the catering supplies, the decorations. Everything was supposed to be there by 9 a.m. sharp. The restaurant, had grown noticeably quieter now, with even the waiters slowing their movements to better hear the unfolding drama. At nearby tables, business executives paused their own conversations, some looking uncomfortable at the public display of workplace abuse, others appearing entertained by the spectacle. The golden light from the chandeliers seemed to spotlight the confrontation, casting harsh shadows across Gregory's face that made his anger appear even more menacing. "I was there at 9:15, Jake said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The traffic on Wilshire was completely 15 minutes late." Gregory's fist came down on the table with enough force to rattle the water glasses and cause several nearby diners to jump. 15 minutes that cost us the most prestigious client on our books. Do you think Mrs. Henderson cares about traffic? Do you think her 300 guests care about your excuses when they're standing in an empty ballroom? From his corner booth, Arnold Schwarzenegger had initially tried to ignore the commotion, focusing instead on his coffee and the morning newspaper spread before him. But as Gregory's voice continued to rise and the verbal assault became increasingly vicious, Arnold found his attention drawn inexorably to the unfolding scene. There was something about the young delivery driver's quiet dignity in the face of such public humiliation that reminded Arnold of his own early days in America, the countless times he had been dismissed, mocked, or underestimated because of his accent, his background, or his unconventional dreams. "The contract is gone," Gregory continued, his voice now reaching every corner of the restaurant. $23,000 a month in regular deliveries, plus special events, plus referrals to her wealthy friends. All gone because you couldn't be bothered to leave 15 minutes earlier. He paused to let the magnitude of the loss sink in, not just for Jake, but for everyone listening. "Do you understand what that means for this company? Do you understand what that means for your job?" Jake's response was so quiet that those at the furthest tables had to strain to hear it. "I understand, sir. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Sorry." Gregory's laugh was harsh and bitter, lacking any trace of genuine humor. "Sorry doesn't pay the bills, Jake. Sorry doesn't explain to the board of directors why we just lost our biggest client. Sorry is what useless employees say when they've failed at the one job they were hired to do." The word useless hung in the air like a toxic cloud, seeming to poison the very atmosphere of the elegant restaurant. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward with interest, sensing that the confrontation was reaching its climax. The waitstaff had essentially stopped working, finding excuses to linger near the table or polish already cleaned glasses at the nearby service station. Arnold's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his coffee cup as he watched the young man's shoulders slump slightly at the devastating pronouncement. There was something profoundly wrong about this scene. Not just the public humiliation, but the casual cruelty with which one human being was destroying another's dignity. In Arnold's world, strength was meant to protect the vulnerable, not crush them. Power was a responsibility, not a weapon to be wielded against those who couldn't fight back. "You see, Jake," Gregory continued, seeming to draw energy from his employees' visible distress, "this is exactly why people like you never amount to anything. You lack the drive, the intelligence, the basic competence required to succeed in a competitive business environment. You're content to drift through life, making excuses for your failures instead of taking responsibility for your inadequacies." The attack had moved beyond professional criticism into personal destruction, and everyone in the restaurant could feel the shift. This was no longer about a missed delivery or a lost client. This was about one man's need to completely dominate and humiliate another human being. The elegant dining room had become an arena, with Gregory as the gladiator and Jake as the defenseless victim thrown to the lions for the entertainment of the crowd. As the verbal assault continued to escalate, none of the diners could have predicted that they were about to witness one of the most powerful and unexpected interventions in the restaurant's history. The man in the corner booth was about to remind everyone present that true strength doesn't come from the ability to destroy others, but from the courage to protect them. The lesson that was about to unfold would be talked about in Beverly Hills, social circles for years to come, and it would change the lives of everyone involved in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The atmosphere in the Golden Palm restaurant had reached a breaking point. What had begun as a private employment dispute had transformed into a public spectacle that made every patron uncomfortable, yet unable to look away. Gregory Hines seemed to feed off the attention, his voice growing louder and more vicious with each passing moment. He had crossed the line from professional criticism into something far darker, a systematic attempt to destroy another human being's sense of worth and dignity. "You know what your problem is, Jake?" Gregory's voice carried across the restaurant like the crack of a whip. "You've never learned that in the real world, there are consequences for failure. You think showing up and going through the motions is enough? Well, let me educate you about how business actually works." He gestured broadly to encompass the elegant dining room around them. "Every person in this restaurant understands what it takes to succeed. They understand that excellence isn't optional, that reliability isn't negotiable, that excuses are for losers." Jake remained silent, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Gregory's shoulder. Years of similar confrontations had taught him that any response would only escalate the situation. His strategy was simple: endure the storm, apologize when it was over, and hope to keep his job. He thought about his mother, who depended on his income for her medication, and his sister, who was 3 months away from graduating college thanks to the overtime hours he worked to pay her tuition. These thoughts gave him the strength to absorb Gregory's verbal blows without breaking. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Gregory's demand snapped through the air with military precision. Several diners actually flinched at the harsh command, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. The restaurant's carefully maintained atmosphere of refined elegance was being systematically destroyed by one man's uncontrolled rage. Jake slowly raised his eyes to meet Gregory's gaze, and for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. There was something unsettling about the contrast between Gregory's barely contained fury and Jake's calm acceptance of his fate. It was like watching a hurricane rage against an unmovable mountain, all sound and fury, yet somehow powerless, against quiet dignity. "That's better," Gregory sneered, interpreting Jake's compliance as a sign of weakness rather than strength. "Now, I want you to look around this restaurant. Really look at these people." He made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire dining room. "These are successful individuals, business leaders, people who matter. And do you know what they see when they look at you?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wishing they were anywhere else but trapped as unwilling witnesses to this psychological demolition. Near the kitchen, a group of waiters had gathered, their professional training warring with their basic human decency as they watched one of their own. For in the service industry, they all understood what it meant to be at the mercy of unreasonable customers and abusive bosses, being systematically humiliated. "They see exactly what I see," Gregory continued, his voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more menacing than his earlier shouting. "They see someone who doesn't belong, someone who will never rise above their station, because they lack the fundamental qualities that separate winners from losers. They see a delivery driver who can't even manage to deliver packages on time, and they wonder how someone so utterly useless managed to survive in a world that demands competence." From his corner booth, Arnold Schwarzenegger felt something stir, deep within his chest. A familiar sensation that he recognized from his bodybuilding days, his early struggles in Hollywood, and his years in politics. It was the same feeling he'd experienced when facing seemingly impossible odds, when everyone around him said his dreams were unrealistic, when critics dismissed him as nothing more than a muscled Austrian with a funny accent. It was the recognition of injustice, the sight of someone being kicked when they were down, the fundamental wrongness of watching strength being used to destroy rather than protect. Arnold's life had been built on the principle that true power came with responsibility. From his earliest days, lifting weights in a cold Austrian gym, he had understood that strength without purpose was meaningless, that success without compassion was hollow, that the ability to inspire others was far more valuable than the ability to intimidate them. He had used his platform as a bodybuilder to motivate countless young athletes, his fame as an actor to bring joy to millions of moviegoers, and his position as governor to serve the people of California. The idea of using power to humiliate someone who couldn't fight back was antithetical to everything he believed in. "You want to know what really frustrates me about people like you?" Gregory's monologue continued, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "It's not just the incompetence that can be fixed with training. It's not even the lack of ambition. Some people are content to remain small. It's the way you drag down everyone around you, the way your mediocrity becomes a cancer that spreads through an organization, lowering standards and creating a culture of acceptable failure." The accusation was particularly cruel because it contained just enough truth to sting. Jake did worry about his performance, did sometimes struggle to meet the increasingly demanding schedules that Lux Logistics imposed on its drivers. The job had become exponentially more difficult over the past few years as the company added more clients without adding additional staff, forcing drivers to handle impossible loads while maintaining perfect delivery records. Jake often worked 12-hour days, skipped meals, and sacrificed his own comfort to meet the company's expectations. Yet it never seemed to be enough. "I've seen your file, Jake," Gregory continued, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what appeared to be performance records. 6 late deliveries in the past month, 3 customer complaints about damaged packages, 2 instances where you failed to obtain proper signatures for high-value items. Each statistic was delivered like a physical blow, designed to strip away any remaining shred of Jake's professional dignity. What Gregory didn't mention, what he would never acknowledge, was that Jake also had the highest customer satisfaction ratings in his district, that elderly clients specifically requested him because of his patience and kindness, that he had personally saved the company thousands of dollars by going above and beyond to solve delivery problems that other drivers would have simply reported as impossible. Gregory's version of Jake's record was accurate, but incomplete, like describing a sunset by listing only the moments when clouds blocked the sun. Arnold found himself studying the young delivery driver with growing interest. There was something familiar about Jake's composure under fire, his refusal to be drawn into an argument he couldn't win, his obvious concern for others despite his own predicament. It reminded Arnold of his own mother, who had endured countless hardships with grace and dignity, who had taught him that true strength often looked like surrender to those who didn't understand its true nature. The Henderson account wasn't just a client. Gregory's voice took on a tone of mock sadness, as if he were delivering a eulogy. It was a relationship. Mrs. Henderson trusted us with the most important events in her social calendar. Charity galas that raised millions for children's hospitals, political fundraisers that shaped the future of this city, art exhibitions that brought culture and beauty to thousands of people, and you, with your casual incompetence, destroyed all of that in a single morning. The accusation was both unfair and devastating. Jake had indeed been 15 minutes late to the Henderson delivery, but the delay had been caused by a massive traffic accident on Wilshire Boulevard that had brought morning commute to a complete standstill. He had called the dispatcher immediately, had tried to find alternate routes, had even considered abandoning his truck and running the final 6 blocks with the packages. But none of that mattered to Gregory, who needed a scapegoat for what was actually a systemic problem with the company's overly ambitious delivery schedules. "Do you know what Mrs. Henderson said when she called to cancel our contract?" Gregory's question was purely rhetorical, designed to twist the knife deeper into Jake's already wounded pride. She said, and I quote, "If Lux Logistics can't manage to deliver flowers for a children's charity event, how can I trust them with anything that really matters?" He paused to let the words sink in, not just for Jake, but for everyone listening. One mistake, Jake. One moment of your characteristic incompetence and years of trust were destroyed forever. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their preparations to listen, creating an eerie quiet that made every breath audible. It was in this moment of suspended animation that Arnold Schwarzenegger made a decision that would change everything. He had heard enough. He had seen enough. The time for passive observation was over. Arnold slowly began to rise from his corner booth, his movements deliberate and controlled. At first, only a few diners noticed the large man standing up in the shadows, but as he stepped into the main dining area, a ripple of recognition began to spread through the restaurant. Whispered conversations started at the tables closest to his booth and spread outward like concentric circles in a pond. "Is that? It can't be. Oh my God, it's really him." The effect was electric. Phones began appearing on tables as diners realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. The Golden Palm restaurant had hosted countless celebrities over the years, but Arnold Schwarzenegger's presence carried a different kind of weight. He wasn't just famous. He was iconic, a living embodiment of the American dream, a man who had conquered multiple industries through sheer force of will and determination. Gregory, still focused on his verbal destruction of Jake, was initially oblivious to the commotion around him. He was so absorbed in his own performance, so intoxicated by his power over his helpless employee, that he failed to notice the shift in the restaurant's energy. Jake, however, sensed the change immediately. Something had altered the dynamic of the room, though he couldn't quite identify what. Arnold walked with the same measured confidence that had carried him through championship bodybuilding competitions, major motion picture sets, and heated political debates. His presence seemed to fill the space around him, not through aggression or intimidation, but through the quiet authority of someone who had earned his place in the world through decades of hard work and achievement. The conversations at nearby and tables died away completely as diners turned to watch his approach. "Excuse me," Arnold's voice cut through Gregory's monologue with the precision of a surgical instrument. The accent that had once been mocked by Hollywood executives now carried the weight of achievement and authority. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Gregory's head snapped around, his face initially showing irritation at the interruption. But as his eyes focused on the imposing figure standing beside their table, his expression transformed rapidly from annoyance to shock to barely concealed panic. Like everyone else in Los Angeles, Gregory knew exactly who Arnold Schwarzenegger was. More importantly, he understood the implications of having one of the most powerful men in Hollywood witness his abusive treatment of an employee. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," Gregory stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. We were just having a business discussion. Nothing that concerns." Arnold held up a hand, and the gesture carried such quiet authority that Gregory's words died in his throat. The restaurant had become completely silent now, with every patron and staff member focused on the unfolding drama. This was no longer just a workplace dispute. It had become something far more significant, a moment when power and principle would collide in front of dozens of witnesses. "I think," Arnold said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the silent restaurant, that there are some things we need to discuss. The silence that followed Arnold's words was so complete that the sound of ice settling in water glasses seemed thunderous. Every person in the Golden Palm restaurant understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just the intervention of a global icon, but a moment when the natural order of power and privilege was about to be fundamentally challenged. Gregory Hines sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. Confusion, recognition, fear, and desperate calculation, all fighting for dominance. Arnold pulled out the chair opposite. Jakin sat down with deliberate slowness, his movements carrying the same controlled precision that had made him a 7-time Mr. Olympia champion. The simple act of joining their table transformed the dynamic completely. What had been a one-sided assault on a defenseless employee was now something entirely different. A confrontation between two men of vastly different character, with the whole world watching. "Please, don't let me interrupt," Arnold continued, his tone conversational but carrying an undertone of steel that made Gregory's hands tremble slightly. "I was finding your management philosophy quite educational." He folded his hands on the table and looked directly at Gregory with the steady gaze of someone who had faced down politicians, studio executives, and world leaders without flinching. "Tell me, what was that word you used to describe Jake?" "I want to make sure I heard it correctly." Gregory's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. The confidence that had carried him through 15 minutes of verbal brutality had completely evaporated, replaced by the panicked realization that he was no longer the most powerful person at the table. We were discussing... It was a private employment matter, Mr. Schwarzenegger. I don't think... Useless, Arnold supplied helpfully, his voice remaining perfectly calm. That was the word, wasn't it? You called this young man useless. He turned slightly to look at Jake, who was staring at the table in obvious discomfort, clearly wishing he could disappear entirely. "Jake, is it? How long have you been working for..." Arnold gestured toward Gregory. "This gentleman's company?" Jake's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. 3 years, sir." 3 years, Arnold repeated thoughtfully, as if the information carried profound significance. "And in those 3 years, how many deliveries would you estimate you've made?" The question caught Jake off guard. He looked up for the first time since Arnold had joined the table, his eyes meeting those of the legendary actor and former governor. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe 15,000, 20,000? Let's say 15,000 to be conservative," Arnold nodded. 15,000 deliveries in 3 years. That's roughly 14 deliveries per working day, assuming you take weekends and holidays off, though something tells me you probably don't. His eyes shifted back to Gregory, who was beginning to sweat despite the restaurant's carefully controlled temperature. "So out of 15,000 successful deliveries, we're here today because of how many failures?" Gregory seemed to sense a trap, but couldn't identify its exact nature. There have been multiple incidents of tardiness, damaged packages, customer complaints. "How many?" Arnold's voice cut through Gregory's attempt at evasion with surgical precision. "Give me a number." "In the past month alone, there have been 6 late deliveries." "In the past month," Arnold interrupted, "how many total deliveries did Jake make?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Gregory clearly hadn't expected this line of inquiry and was scrambling to maintain his narrative of Jake's incompetence. "I don't have those exact figures with me." "Estimate." Arnold's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. "How many deliveries in a typical month?" 300, maybe 350, Gregory admitted reluctantly. "So 6 problems out of 350 deliveries," Arnold calculated aloud. That's a success rate of approximately 98.3%. He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know, when I was governor of California, I would have killed for department heads with a 98% success rate. Hell, when I was making movies, if 98% of my scenes worked, the film was considered a masterpiece. The mathematical reality of Jake's performance record hung in the air like a revelation. Around the restaurant, diners were beginning to understand that they had been witnessing not the justified discipline of an incompetent employee, but the systematic abuse of someone whose crime was being imperfect rather than useless. Cell phones appeared on tables as people began recording what was clearly becoming a legendary moment. Gregory's face had taken on a sickly pallor as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling under scrutiny. You don't understand the pressures of our industry, Mr. Schwarzenegger. In logistics, there's no margin for error. Our clients expect perfection, and when we fail to deliver, Arnold repeated slowly, we take responsibility like adults and work to improve our systems. We don't publicly humiliate our most reliable employees to make ourselves feel better about our own failures. His voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that made several nearby diners lean forward in anticipation. Now wait, just a minute. Gregory's desperation finally overrode his fear, causing him to revert to his earlier aggression. You may be famous, but you don't know anything about running a business. You don't understand the complexities of managing people who lack motivation, who need clear consequences for their actions. Arnold's smile was slow and cold, like winter sunshine. You're absolutely right, Gregory. I don't know anything about running a business. I've only built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, launched several successful companies, and governed the world's fifth-largest economy. But please, educate me about the complexities of management. The sarcasm in Arnold's voice was so subtle that it took Gregory several seconds to realize he had just been thoroughly insulted. When the realization hit, his face flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and rage. Around the restaurant, suppressed chuckles could be heard as diners began to appreciate the masterful way Arnold was dismantling Gregory's authority without raising his voice or using a single profane word. Furthermore, Arnold continued, his voice gaining momentum like a gathering storm, I'm curious about your leadership philosophy. You seem to believe that the best way to improve performance is through public humiliation and personal attacks. Tell me, how's that working out for your employee retention rates? Gregory's silence was answer enough. The truth was that Lux Logistics had one of the highest turnover rates in the industry, with drivers quitting regularly rather than endure the toxic management culture that Gregory had created. The company was constantly hiring and training new employees, which was not only expensive, but also resulted in the kind of service inconsistencies that lost clients like Mrs. Henderson. Let me tell you something about leadership. Arnold's voice took on the cadence of someone who had spent years motivating others to achieve greatness. Real leadership isn't about making people afraid of you. It's about inspiring them to be better than they thought possible. It's about taking responsibility when things go wrong and sharing credit when things go right. It's about understanding that your job as a manager isn't to tear people down, it's to build them up. The words hit Gregory like physical blows. Everything Arnold was describing represented the opposite of his management style, which was built on fear, intimidation, and the systematic destruction of his employees' confidence. For years, Gregory had convinced himself that his harsh methods were necessary, that people like Jake needed to be broken down before they could be rebuilt. Now, facing one of the most successful men in America, his philosophy was being exposed as not just cruel but fundamentally counterproductive. You want to know what I see when I look at Jake? Arnold continued, his gaze shifting to the young delivery driver who was still staring at the table in obvious discomfort. "I see someone who has been showing up every day for 3 years doing a job that requires physical stamina, mental focus, and emotional resilience. I see someone who has maintained a 98% success rate while working for a manager who treats him like garbage. I see someone who probably makes more positive difference in people's lives in a single week than you do in a year." Jake's head snapped up in surprise. No one had ever described his work in such terms. To him, it was just a job, a necessary means of supporting his family and paying bills. He had never considered that his daily interactions with customers, his careful handling of their packages, his willingness to go the extra mile to solve delivery problems, might actually matter to anyone. "Do you know what makes someone truly useless?" Arnold's question was directed at Gregory, but his voice carried across the restaurant to everyone present. "It's not making mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn and grow. It's not being imperfect. Perfection is an impossible standard that destroys more people than it helps. What makes someone truly useless is using their position of power to destroy others instead of building them up. What makes someone useless is being so insecure about their own abilities that they need to tear down good people to feel superior." Chidia, accusation hung in the air like a sword, and Gregory could feel the eyes of every person in the restaurant boring into him. He was no longer the powerful executive disciplining an incompetent employee. He was the bully being called out by someone with real authority and genuine strength. The role reversal was so complete and so public that he knew his reputation would never recover. "I think," Arnold said quietly, standing up from the table with the same controlled grace that had marked his arrival, "that this conversation is over. Jake, would you walk with me for a moment? I'd like to speak with you privately." As Arnold and Jake moved away from the table toward the restaurant's entrance, Gregory sat alone in the spotlight of the main dining room, suddenly understanding what it felt like to be the object of everyone's contempt. The whispered conversations that had followed Arnold's intervention were now focused entirely on him, and none of what he could hear was complimentary. His phone began buzzing with text messages as word of the confrontation spread through social media, and he realized with growing horror that his 15 minutes of power had just cost him everything he had spent years building. The warm California afternoon air felt like a blessing after the suffocating tension inside the Golden Palm restaurant. Arnold and Jake stood on the sidewalk outside, the contrast between the chaotic energy of Beverly Hills traffic and the quiet dignity of their conversation, creating a surreal bubble of calm. Jake still looked shell-shocked, as if he couldn't quite believe that one of the most famous men in the world had just defended him against his abusive boss. "You know," Arnold began, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had commanded the restaurant's attention. "When I first came to America, I was 19 years old with $7 in my pocket and a dream that everyone said was impossible. You want to know what the casting directors told me when I first auditioned for movies?" Jake looked up at Arnold with genuine curiosity, temporarily forgetting his own troubles. The idea that someone as successful as Arnold Schwarzenegger had ever faced rejection seemed almost impossible to imagine. "They said my body was too big, my accent was too thick, and my name was unpronounceable," Arnold continued with a slight smile. "They told me I should consider changing my name to something more American, maybe lose some muscle mass, and definitely work with a dialect coach to get rid of my Austrian accent. In other words, they wanted me to become someone completely different before they would even consider giving me a chance." The parallel to Jake's situation wasn't lost on either of them. Both had been told they weren't good enough, that they needed to fundamentally change who they were to have any value in their respective worlds. The difference was that Arnold had had the luxury of choice, while Jake was trapped by economic necessity and family obligations. But here's what I learned. Arnold's voice took on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. The people who tell you that you're not good enough are usually the people who are most afraid of what you might become if you believe in yourself. Gregory back there? He's not angry at you because you're incompetent. He's angry because deep down, he knows that you have something he'll never have: integrity, compassion, and the quiet strength that comes from doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Jake felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. For so long, he had accepted other people's assessments of his worth, had internalized the criticism and complaints, until he began to believe that maybe he really was as inadequate as they said. But hearing those words from someone who had conquered seemingly impossible challenges made him wonder if perhaps there was more to his story than he had realized. "I don't understand why you helped me," Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible above the traffic noise. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could have just ignored what was happening and finished your lunch." Arnold was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something far beyond the bustling street. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of personal experience and hard-earned understanding. "Let me tell you about a day in 1968 when I was competing in my first major bodybuilding competition in London. I was 21 years old, barely spoke English, and I was convinced I was going to win because I had been training harder than anyone else for months." He paused, seeming to relive the memory before continuing. "There was this older competitor, a British guy named William Ortiz, who everyone said was past his prime. The other bodybuilders were making jokes about him, calling him washed up, saying he should retire gracefully instead of embarrassing himself on stage. I was young and stupid, so I laughed along with them." Jake listened intently, sensing that this story was leading somewhere important. Competition day comes, and William steps on stage. And you know what? He was magnificent. Not because he had the biggest muscles or the most perfect symmetry, but because he carried himself with a dignity and presence that made everyone else look like amateurs. He didn't win that day. That's not the point of the story. The point is that after the competition, when everyone else was celebrating or making excuses, William came over to congratulate me on my performance. Arnold's voice grew softer, more reflective. He told me that he had watched me train, that he could see I had talent, but more importantly, that I had character. He said that in bodybuilding, like in life, the people who last aren't necessarily the most gifted ones. They're the ones who show up consistently, who treat others with respect, and who never stop trying to improve. Then he said something I'll never forget. The measure of a man isn't how he treats his equals or his superiors. It's how he treats people who can't do anything for him. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jake was beginning to understand why Arnold had intervened in the restaurant, why he had taken the time to defend someone he had never met. 6 months later, I found out that William was battling cancer, Arnold continued. He had known during that competition that it might be one of his last. He could have spent those final months feeling sorry for himself, but instead he chose to use his remaining time to encourage younger athletes and share the wisdom he had gained over decades of competition. He died 2 years later, but the lesson he taught me that day has shaped every major decision I've made since. Arnold turned to face Jake directly, his expression serious but kind. When I saw what was happening in that restaurant, I didn't see a delivery driver being disciplined by his boss. I saw William Ortiz being mocked by people who didn't understand what real strength looks like. I saw someone who shows up every day, who does his job with dignity, despite being undervalued and underappreciated, and I knew I had a choice. I could ignore it like everyone else was doing, or I could honor the lesson William taught me about standing up for people who can't defend themselves. The comparison left Jake speechless. The idea that someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger could see any similarity between him and a respected athlete was almost too much to process. For years, he had thought of himself as ordinary at best, a disappointment at worst. Now he was being told that his daily struggles and small acts of persistence were actually forms of courage that deserved recognition and respect. But what happens now? Jake asked, the practical reality of his situation beginning to reassert itself. I probably don't have a job anymore. Gregory isn't going to forgive being humiliated like that, especially not in public. And honestly, I can't afford to be unemployed. I have people depending on me. Arnold nodded with understanding. The harsh reality was that while his intervention had given Jake a moment of dignity and validation, it hadn't solved the underlying problems of economic insecurity and workplace abuse that millions of people faced every day. Real change required more than just one powerful person standing up to one bully. It required systemic transformation and sustained effort. You're right that Gregory probably won't be calling you back to work, Arnold agreed. But you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to us is being forced out of situations that were slowly destroying our spirits. Sometimes we need to lose something that was making us smaller in order to find something that will help us grow. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I'm going to give you the number of Corey Anderson, who runs West Coast Distribution. They're one of the most ethical logistics companies in California, and they're always looking for drivers with your kind of track record. More importantly, they treat their employees like human beings rather than disposable assets. Jake stared at the phone number that Arnold was writing on a business card, hardly daring to believe that this conversation was really happening. Why would they hire me? If Gregory gives me a bad reference, because I'm going to personally recommend you, Arnold said simply. And because after what happened in that restaurant today, I suspect Gregory is going to be too busy trying to save his own career to spend time sabotaging yours. Trust me, a 98% success rate speaks for itself, regardless of what one bitter manager might say. As if summoned by their conversation, Gregory appeared in the restaurant's doorway, his face pale and his hands shaking as he clutched his phone. Even from a distance, it was clear that the calls and messages he had been receiving were not congratulatory. In the age of social media, his public meltdown had already been shared thousands of times, complete with video footage taken by restaurant patrons. His career in management was effectively over, and everyone knew it. There's something else I want you to understand, Arnold continued, deliberately turning his back on Gregory to focus entirely on Jake. What happened in there wasn't really about a late delivery or a lost client. It was about fear. Gregory is afraid because he knows that good people like you make him look bad by comparison. He knows that if his superiors ever really looked at the numbers, they'd realize that you're an asset and he's a liability. His entire management style is built on making other people feel small so he can feel big. The insight was revelatory for Jake, who had spent so long accepting blame for problems that were largely systemic. He had never considered that his manager's cruelty might stem from insecurity rather than legitimate authority, that the constant criticism might say more about Gregory's character than his own performance. I want you to promise me something, Arnold said, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a sacred pact. Promise me that you'll never let anyone convince you that hard work and decency are worthless. Promise me that when you're in a position to help someone else, and someday you will be, you'll remember this moment and choose to lift them up instead of tearing them down. Jake nodded, though he could barely trust himself to speak. The emotional weight of the afternoon, from the humiliation in the restaurant to this unexpected mentorship, had left him feeling raw and vulnerable. but also strangely hopeful for the first time in years. Arnold extended his hand for a firm handshake, a gesture that felt like the formal conclusion of Jake's old life and the beginning of something entirely new. Remember, Jake, success isn't about never falling down. It's about how you get back up, who you choose to help along the way, and whether you use your strength to build others up or tear them down. You've already proven you have what it takes. Now you just need to believe it yourself. As Arnold walked away, disappearing into the crowd of Beverly Hills shoppers and tourists, Jake stood on the sidewalk, holding the business card and trying to process everything that had just happened. Behind him, through the restaurant's windows, he could see Gregory still frantically making phone calls, his career imploding in real time as the consequences of his cruelty finally caught up with him. 6 months later, Jake would be named Employee of the Month at West Coast Distribution for the 3rd consecutive time. He would use his improved financial situation to help his sister finish college and to ensure his mother received the medical care she needed. More importantly, he would become known throughout the company as the driver who always had time to help new employees learn the routes, who never spoke badly about customers or co-workers, and who embodied the kind of quiet leadership that inspired others to be better versions of themselves. And sometimes, when he was training new drivers or helping solve particularly challenging delivery problems, Jake would remember the lesson that Arnold Schwarzenegger had taught him on a Beverly Hills sidewalk, that true strength isn't about having power over others, but about using whatever power you have to lift others up. It's a lesson that changed not just one man's life, but rippled outward to touch everyone he encountered, proving that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single act of unexpected kindness. Has anyone ever stood up for you when you couldn't defend yourself? Have you ever been the person who chose to help someone who was being treated unfairly? Share your stories in the comments below, because every act of courage, no matter how small, has the power to change someone's entire world. And remember, respect and kindness never go out of style. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.